Based in Larkspur, California, Stephen A. Nielsen is a U.S. registered patent attorney with many years of experience in patent procurement and in achieving favorable results in federal court in the field of intellectual property litigation. Mr. Nielsen is the past chairperson of the intellectual property section of the Marin County Bar Association. Mr. Nielsen received his JD in 1987 from Bolt Hall, University of California at Berkeley, and also holds a BA in computer science. He may be contacted at steve@nielsenpatents.com, on his website, nielsenpatents.com, or via his LinkedIn page.
Good afternoon. I'm Steve Nielsen. I'm a registered patent attorney out of Marin County, California, and I'm here today to present Diversity and Inclusion in the Legal Profession. It's put on by the Center for Continuing Education. I'm out of Larkspur, California, and my name, phone number, LinkedIn link is right here if you wish to send me any feedback. And I did this presentation 2 years ago, and there's new material, all of it found by Bob Moselle for CCE. But what's interesting is I do get email, and I respond to every email. Someone even wrote me a handwritten letter. So I do value your feedback on the presentation. This is one of the newer CLE requirements. I know it's now required in New York and Illinois and perhaps some other jurisdictions as well. It's sort of a takeoff on bias. And you'll see some of my common themes and some of my other videos that I've done here. And my presentation is an attempt for me to study the current literature, give my own analysis of it, and give my own conclusions, just as we all did in law school and taking an exam. I don't pretend to know everything about this, but I can read and write as well as anyone. And so this is a compilation of the current literature. And of course, I sparkle in my own theories and my own experiences in the world. So my twin daughters give me a hard time about what are my qualifications to present this. And the best example I have is in law school, I had a professor who wrote books on fly fishing, although he spent most of his time teaching law. But he said he did some fly fishing and he studied every book known, and he did a great job and got his books on fly fishing published. Another theory that I enjoy is that my high school English professor said that you don't have to put your hand in a meat grinder to know that it's going to hurt. So we can use our common sense in figuring things out as well. What's also interesting is that there aren't a lot of diversity and inclusion videos out there. Since doing the first one 2 years ago, I've gotten my hands on every one that I can find. And I do enjoy the different approaches by the various different presenters. So that helps with my knowledge base to see how do other people put it together. But I can't say that my approach has really changed by seeing the work of others. And so that leads to the next question. What are the requirements for the presentation today? They vary from state to state. And from what I've read, the state requirements, so there's no set agenda. So I'm going to just use our common sense, and we'll have a learned discussion and analysis of the current and past literature on this pretty interesting subject. What does the current literature tell us? The theme I have, I'm going to be a broken record here, is that we're not given many coherent solutions, and the overall analysis of what's changed in the last 20 years or 2 years, that things have not gotten a lot better. There's often a disconnect between express commitments of diversity committees, say in large law firms, and what really happens. So what does the current literature tell us? It tells us that first generation lawyers have challenges. Now this makes perfect sense to me. My father was a lawyer, and his great grandfather was a judge in Denmark. And so when you grow up in a culture of law, you hear things at the dinner table at starting at age 6, and it sort of sinks in your mind. So I can imagine that going to law school, not watching trials that your father was doing and not being in that culture would be a big culture shock. So I can totally understand first generation lawyers and first generation college students have challenges that I think aren't really honored in our society. There's a big movement supported by law schools and law firms. But can we expect law firms to make a difference to a significant number of first generation lawyers? Because the sad fact is, to get a job at a big law firm, they go to the top schools, pick the top of the class. And in college, I had a great professor who said, the start to get into a great law school requires arguably prep school and a lot of things that the average person just doesn't have. So while I applaud the large law firms for their attempts and other support groups, an argument can be made that by the time somebody's out of high school, it's a difficult place to go to a good college, and from there, a difficult place to get into a great law school, difficult to get into a large law firm. So a lot has to happen 25 years ahead of time. I have this slide here on the pressure for law school ranking hurts women. And I got some really good hate mail on this when I did this 2 years ago. And what I'm trying to point out here, this is what the literature says. I'm keeping this slide in this year because it still makes sense to me, as ugly as it is. And the big picture, to summarize, is that these law schools, they want to get their ranking up. And thus, they take people with the highest LSAT scores. And there's been studies that have been verified that say that women tend to do a little bit less than on LSAT scores, which baffles me, because I think in general, school in general is geared more for women than for boys, more for girls than for boys. I know going from kindergarten through high school, girls seem to have an easier time in school. So but the point is that the law school ranking arguably hurts women because women arguably have lower LSATs. They don't get into the law school. It's perceived as to be better. Of course, I question whether they are any better. And they don't get into the big law firms. And somehow a lot of our metrics are equating women's success in large law firms to become partners, to become chairpersons of sections as success or as an advancement of diversity. Later in this presentation, I question that presumption, but currently it's still considered a benchmark of success and integration for people who are considered to be of diverse background. And that term too, we're going to pick apart later on. Here in this slide, I question again, do women generally score lower on the LSAT? As of 2020 in March, in the middle of our plague here, that still seems to be the accepted data point. Both law and medicine have diversity challenges. There's a great article in 2017 talking about the importance of diversity, and also that, like a lot of professions, such as law and medicine, seem to be immune to diversity efforts, and the public arguably suffers because of that, because you get a skewed representation of society in these professions. And let's say you're of a diverse background and you're not seeing diverse doctors or lawyers in your life or in the boardroom, it can be a bit discouraging. And I'm as guilty as anyone, because I have twin daughters, and I made sure they always had female healthcare providers. I wanted to give them role models. That's just how I felt. And fortunately, I was able to do that. So I could understand the angst when that can't happen. And this one statement is still true. It states, in general, no well-paid industry looks like the general public for gender or race. And I added emphasis on this from this article, and it's still a sobering statement that's made, and it's looks at the broader picture that I think is worth looking at. If we're going to promote diversity, inclusion in the legal profession, I think we need to step back, look at society at large, look at professions at large, and this article does a good job in doing that. So throughout this presentation today, we're going to look beyond law at society in general. Here's a quote from the National Association of Women Lawyers, NAWL, the link's up there. And it talks about the survey they did and the different data points that we now have. Their conclusion is that we aren't doing enough. It's not working. You can read all this fine print yourself, but that's the big picture. And this article gives a more granular analysis of that. It says that we're going to still face the challenges. The National Association for Law Placement, NALP, states that representation of Black or African American associates is a little bit better, just by a hair. So again, I'm sorry to be a broken record, but I just want to show the various articles that show whatever we're doing isn't working, which I think is an important factor to consider, that it's not working. So let's think about things that might work that aren't necessarily the literature, but I think this field has room for that because the literature is saying whatever they're doing isn't working. So I'm going to ask the audience to bear with me as I present some other ideas later in the presentation. It's a slow and discouraging trend. Again, this is what all the articles talk about. Here's a good stat on partnership in the large law firms. Unfortunately, that's our current benchmark. Here's a newer article, again found by Bob Moselle of Continuing Education, and it talks about different attention points, different touch points to promote diversity. And here are 7 things, including different sayings. Diversity elevates the practice. What does it mean for clients to insist on diversity? Maybe to have a greater flexibility in location and hours, true teamwork, and there's client-initiated collaboration. It says nothing will change if we don't insist. And so in this article, this author uses the team approach for the practice of the law, which I'm familiar with, and I do work with a lot of large law firms on some litigation matters, and so I get to see how they work. And I did start out at a very large law firm in San Francisco, so I understand the gestalt, the teamwork, which is a beautiful thing because they often have big budgets. And so my question is that, at least here in Marin, and I think throughout the country, a lot of lawyers work as solo practitioners or in groups of 2 or 3. And as my father would say, the average person cannot afford the average lawyer. So the average person isn't going to a large law firm. Hence, most lawyers are solo practitioners with lower overhead so they can meet everyday needs. Without a team approach in the large law firms, can you really meet these platitudes here in this article of January 23rd, 2020? And I'm thinking not. A very small percentage of lawyers work for these large law firms. So this team approach, it looks great. And I think it supports diversity because maybe people have childcare goals. I won't say challenges. They want to stay home more with their children and do things there. So this team approach may not work so well. On the other hand, a lot of clients like the Mercedes-AMG model slogan, which is one person assembles one engine at a time, sort of the hands-on approach. But again, that works for smaller projects such as assembling a motion, or in this case, a mechanical object. So there's pros and cons both ways. Again, I'm a broken record here. The new reports are not encouraging. These links and these headlines were taken here in March of 2020, and you can read them yourself. Race and gender bias are rampant in law. There hasn't been much progress in 10 years. and only a handful of firms have taken action on the diversity quest. Is mental health a point of diversity? There's some great work by Kelly Greenwood going on in San Francisco with her company, and a lot of other movements to diminish the stigma of mental health challenges at work. And a lot of people say, well, mental health challenges, that's a form of diversity. I don't have a real opinion on that. And I've seen just a little bit of literature on that. It's a question worth asking. Here's some good links on this. It talks about addressing mental health issues. I think it's important to address them to end the stigma. Arguably, it's a point of diversity. People who are a little borderline autistic tend to be good patent lawyers because they can focus and do the same thing over and over all day long. That's another subject. This is from the article above. It's called The Do's of Discussing Diversity. And I'm going to spend some time and just sort of read these, although all of you read better than I do, but they're interesting points, and it's a newer theory for 2020, and I think they're quite helpful. So the do's of discussing diversity: make it known that you want to be corrected if you say something potentially offensive. And I trust the audience here is going to send me email and letters if I offend anyone, and I usually do when I do these topics. Ask direct questions rather than skirting the subjects. I think sort of a Northern European directness is a very effective way of communication. Do ask what you can do to promote diversity within the firm. You never know what ideas you're going to hear from firm members. Do promote open discussion of diversity. It's good to talk about things. And I like this one. Do be forgiving of politically incorrect statements made by others if the person has good intentions and is trying to learn. Of course, I'm going to offend some people here because the term politically incorrect statements, I personally find offensive. I think our First Amendment gives us rights to express various political views. Some views may be less popular than others over time, but I think the gist of this just means if somebody says something that's offensive, try to address it, educate each other, and move on. Otherwise, we're going to get stuck. This next one: do ensure the diverse employment has meaningful involvement in work if you advertise or pitch the diversity to obtain the work. So what does that mean? I think it means that if a firm markets itself to clients as being diverse, be sure you have diverse employees on the file. And maybe later we'll look into the definition of what is a diverse employee. But this one makes sense, but it's interesting. And I like this one. Do let others know when they have offended someone or you. This is good. Just say, hey, I found that offensive. That hurt my feelings. You express why, and then you move on. There's something called, nonviolent communication by a very famous author out there, and you can just express your feelings, not get in someone's face about it, address it, and move on. Because at the end of the day, we do need to get to work and get the job done for the client. We can't wallow all day in our own personal agony at work. The don'ts of discussing diversity. Don't be offended if a diverse person would rather not answer your questions or engage in a discussion. I had a good buddy in law school who was of a diverse background, and he just chose to never acknowledge it for whatever reasons, and that was his business, and that was fine. Do not make disparaging comments about any race, gender, or sexual orientation. You don't know the background of the audience or their family. I think in this day and age, we can presume that we're talking to people of all races, genders, orientations, and every other touch point of diversity there is. So I think we're a product of what we practice. So whether in private or in public, we speak as we would want to be heard by all. I like this one. Do not start a conversation about diversity with the phrase, "So what are you?" The problem there, as you can all see, is does our skin color define us, our sex define us? Hopefully not. I think our spirit, our brain, what we do, how we are with others, that's more indicative of what defines us. So what are you? I think we're a product of what we do, not how we're born. Do not let it slide if attorneys in your office roll their eyes or belittle discussions of diversity. It is particularly important that leadership shuts down this behavior. I'm sure we can relate to the old persons network where the subject is not taken seriously, but it does start with just one person not putting up with it to help our society move forward. The next one, do not force diverse attorneys to, quote, use their diversity for your convenience if it makes them uncomfortable. So I think this one is just really self-explanatory, but very good. If someone's arguably looks to be have diversity, they may feel uncomfortable sort of being displayed. And maybe they want to be known for their good work in their mind than anything else, which is something to be honored. Do not bring up someone else's diversity during an introduction to a new person or potential client. It will be transparent to everyone why you are bringing it up. This actually happens more than you know. And I remember in a meeting I was in, we're talking about somebody maybe joining the meeting or the association, and their orientation was brought out. And we all thought, well, why do we care? It's just not something to bring up or really even a data point for any of us, but these things do happen. I like this one. Do not tell people who are diverse, but do not look diverse that they, quote, don't count. I've never encountered this or seen it, but I guess it happens. And it's a good point to know. So I like this article, and I like these do's and don'ts. I think it's probably the most substantive new information has come out in the last 2 years on this subject. And above the above slides, there's links to the more complete article. Covering the basis of diversity and inclusion. The literature here goes back for decades. Not great progress in the field using the current metrics, which, as we mentioned before, is, quote, big law. There are no silver bullet systems known. And this is a nationwide challenge, or worldwide challenge, arguably, although I think France treats a lot of people a lot better. This could be a national challenge reaching all professions. New York has a diversity and inclusion office known as D&I. And from the New York State Bar website, they talk about what does a D&I program have to include, or it says it may include such things as implicit, explicit bias, equal access to justice, serving a diverse population, diversity and inclusion initiatives in the legal profession, and sensitivity to culture and other differences when interacting with members of the public, judges, jurors, litigants, attorneys, and court personnel. So this year, I've been very guilty of, I won't say not being sensitive to other cultures, but not attributing certain attributes to certain cultures. A lot of my clients are now from China, and they are hard workers and have done very well in a lot of different ways. And so I sort of have a stereotype as to their culture. I try to be sensitive to that. And I'm guilty of thinking maybe they engage in less direct communication as compared to people in the Midwest or Northern Europeans. And that's not always true. So being culture sensitive to a culture means that there is arguably means that there is a stereotypical culture among a group of people, which doesn't hold true. So being sensitive to the culture and other differences when interacting with members of various groups, that can be kind of sticky. Maybe certain things are pretty safe. For example, with Japanese, there's a cultural tradition of presenting a business card When they initiate that, I know the drill and I do that. And that's easy. But if it's a method of communication or a way of saying things, it may not be true for everyone in that culture. This is one of my favorite subjects here. Categories of diversity appear to include, at this time, race, ethnicity, national origin, gender, sexual orientation, gender identity, sort of a newer one. We have the he, they, she, we, religion, age, or physical disability. There's a broader definition of diversity that we talk about here in our little county of Marin in Northern California. It's defining it as anything that causes difficulty or is an impediment in practicing law or interacting with others. So this broader form of diversity has nothing to do with gender, ethnicity, where you're from, but has to do with things such as age, can be difficult as we get older, lack of computer skills, mobility challenge. In other words, an endless list. Anything that causes difficulty or is an impediment in practicing law or interacting with others, and has become more computer literate, especially during this plague period with Corona right now. Computer skills come into play because a lot of law firms, while law is deemed, quote, an essential service, are working from home. And if you have good computer skills, it's easier to telecommute in through your VPN and find the files. If you don't, it's more difficult. So I like this broader definition of diversity, and it's a little more treatable or manageable because you can teach things. You can teach computer skills. You can get aids for mobility to help you interact and practice law. So that's sort of an encouraging definition. In Illinois, there's a 1 hour requirement of diversity and inclusion. And this requirement can be met by mentoring, which is a great subject that we're going to get into here. Mentoring and networking seem to be an answer. What does the data show? Mentoring and networking groups seem to be in vogue. It makes sense. It helps first generation lawyers get used to the environment. It provides a great support system. The diversity section of Marin County runs such a program with great success. Also, we have informal mixers in our Marin County bar sections, such as we have the IP section, the business law section, and we have these mixers, and it's good for breaking the ice. It's good for inclusion. And I really like we say diversity and inclusion. I think inclusion is really one of the more powerful answers to this challenge. Inclusion, based on decades of perceived failure, is that we're not going to solve the issue soon. And the challenge of inclusion seems to be less formidable if we think about making life a friendlier experience. And there are things that work, things that don't work. I remember when I worked for a large law firm, they had the softball game was the worst. I'm a lousy softball player, and I felt less than. It was miserable. And so the lesson here is to pick events that are doable for all. Maybe dinner parties, going to art exhibits, things that everyone can participate on a more equal basis. Also, in figuring out where we are in this challenge, is our definition of reaching the top, is that correct? And should that be reconsidered? As we talked about before, only a very small percentage of lawyers work in large firms. Making partner is often used as a metric of success for a diverse group. While we can all agree that everyone should have an equal chance at such a goal, how relevant is that goal in doing diversity and inclusion? The other issue is, not many partners at big firms seem to be having a good time. That's just my own personal observation. They seem to be dying 1,000 deaths with the pressure that they have. Other partners at large law firms seem to be pretty happy, but I don't know if that's just the be-all end goal, but it's currently one of the metrics. And we're going to talk about other metrics that might be more reasonable, such as, is running a solo or small firm considered success? In one article here, this article by Carolyn Fent talks about women-owned law firms doing well and growing well, and almost at 4 times the rate of male-owned companies. So I think that's a better metric of success. Or the rate of growth of female-owned businesses or law firms is almost 4 times the rate of the male-owned counterparts. To me, that tells me that women are doing pretty well in an environment that, to me, sounds more hospitable and sounds like a more overall successful place to work, where you have a more quality of life possible. What is bias? How does that work? What does it mean? And I get a lot of hate mail on this, but this is one of my favorite subjects, that and prejudice. There's bias against those perceived to be in a different group. First-generation lawyers may have a bias against them. And there's a test bias, meaning that law schools want students with high LSAT scores that want to score 2 points lower. So what are some more interesting pictures of bias? Bias can address the issue of why people favor members of their own group over members of other groups. Can we even acknowledge this premise? Do we dare look at the work of social psychologists and their peer-reviewed studies? And of course, you know, we're going to look at that because I think it's very relevant. And this gets into a theory of group theory. Studies of group theory is when groups are defined by our protected classifications. Is that a correct type of group? And is group theory relevant when groups are defined by the protected classifications such as race, natural origin, etc.? Here's a proposed big picture approach. Is the reduction of bias in the enlightened self-interest of the members of the legal profession? Should we be mindful of factors beyond the protected classifications to direct issues of improper bias, improper discrimination? Should we discuss real-world examples of successful bias diffusion? I think the answer is yes. What is bias? Let's tear that word apart like we're going to tear apart the word discrimination later on. Look at the bowl of dog food and the apple there. Which one are you leaning to? Probably most of us are leaning toward the apple. We're sort of biased toward the apple. I don't think we really need to judge dog food or apple. We can both kind of imagine what they taste like or smell like. So it's a bias. We're leaning for that. We're physically moved toward the apple. And of course, in every presentation, I got to throw in a patent that I did. And there's a concept called mechanical bias. And a spring may urge or push an arm member in a certain direction. So again, we're sort of getting a push here of bias, and that's very relevant to figure this out. Group bias. An attraction or lean toward members of one's own perceived group, a distrust for members of other group members. This leads to stereotypes. Can we study this in a factual and unemotional matter, such as a spring bias in a mechanical arm? The answer is probably no, but we're going to study it here anyway. In addition to bias, what is discrimination? And in college, I had a really great professor, Ed Bronson, who said that it's considered good to have discriminating tastes in wine or fine foods versus wanting to eat or drink, say, $2 Chuck at Trader Joe's versus a nicer bottle of wine. So that discrimination sort of presumes that you sort of know what things are going to taste like. Let's look at the dictionary to look at how is discrimination defined. One is differentiating, analytical. So here we have a positive connotation toward being discriminating. Number two, noting differences or distinctions with nicety, discerning, a discriminating interpreter of events, having excellent taste or judgment, a discriminating interior designer. It could also mean a differential, such as a tariff. And it also could mean possessing distinctive features capable of being differentiated or discriminative. Discriminating taste. Here we have some sage roasted butternut squash. I have a bias or discrimination for that. Tequila, silver or añejo. Do we judge tequila by its age or price? So this is getting into prejudging, looking at the color of the tequila, its price point versus experiencing it. Some tequila is better than others. We got to keep an open mind. As I tell my twin daughters, if Costco doesn't have it, we don't need it. Some of the brand name tequila or products of Costco is just great. So it's important to sort of dig in as you would. You wouldn't judge a cover by the book. Here's a good quote from Nelson Mandela. I learned that courage was not the absence of fear, but the triumph of it. Brave man is not who does not feel afraid, but who conquers that fear. So to me, that means let's learn about things and figure things out, which gets us into a controversial slide. How do we learn to hate? And gets us into this even more controversial slide. How did we evolve? And I really like going back to The Evolution of Man. There's a great book by Bernowski, published in the 80s, called The Ascent of Man. And it talks about how did we evolve? One thing that always strikes me is that it was only the last 10,000 years that we've been able to earn a living sitting at a desk. 10,000 years ago and earlier, we were moving around trying to survive. And how did we evolve to survive? I think this is where group theory comes into play on a genetic or lower brain level. Arguably, out on the plains, say 100,000 years ago, you got to figure out someone, a friend or foe. Are they in my group? And the definition of group could be your own gathering of people who you live with in your village. And you needed a quick decision on this. You can see there's a fight or flight. There's different weapons used here. And so I don't want to ignore Darwin's theories on this. There are evolutionary, physical, emotional advantages of being in a group. From an evolutionary standpoint, you have efficiencies in hunting, gathering and child rearing, companionship, emotional support. And it was difficult to survive alone in the Stone Age. Today, we can live a siloed life, go to your office, maybe exercise, go home, watch Netflix all night, and you're done. You can live like that. It's kind of miserable, but we can do it. The Stone Age couldn't be done. And so we have evolved to be social animals. And a lot of good authors have said, no man is an island. Group study data. There's a famous Holocaust survivor, a psychologist interested in the behavior of people placed in groups. He attempted to find a threshold of relevant human attributes that would lead to group prejudice. He failed. Even groups selected via a coin toss of we versus them would have hostility against one another. And is this relevant today? Being mindful of all human attributes. So what does this mean? What does this paragraph really mean? To me, it means that if we identify in a particular group, we're going to have, through group theory, through evolution, an affinity toward our group and a bias against others and other groups. It's just arguably in our DNA and our lower brainstem. But I think it's good we address this so through knowledge and education and exposure, we can get out of it. This is one of my favorite slides here. The Robbers Cave experiment in 1954, a time when there are fewer regulations on human experimentation. A researcher took 22 12-year-old boys to a state park and randomly selected one to be on one of two teams. And in a short group of time, the two teams developed severe prejudice and hostilities against opposite team members. And so, I'm not the first to talk about this or think about it, that in-group and out-group theories were supported. Arguably not a perfect experiment by today's standards, but it just sort of goes in this whole group theory. And you'll see an interesting juxtaposition when we talk about solving some of the problems by putting people in groups. Is group theory supported by current events? Over the last 100 years, great many people have been killed over political events such as war and genocide. We seem to have never-ending warfare between groups of people. So are we really surprised to have some in-group versus out-of-group conflict in our legal profession? This may seem like a stark thing to say here, but isn't it true that in the last 100 years, we've had over 200 million people die over political events? Isn't it true that we seem to have never-ending warfare between groups of people? Ergo, we shouldn't be surprised we have some in-group versus out-of-group conflict in our, quote, civilized world, such as the legal profession or other professions. It's just a profound thought that I like to put forth. Groups or traits to consider in the reduction of bias in the legal profession. Just a theory, since traditional group behavior occurs when group members are selected by a flip of a coin, we need to be sensitive to everyone every day. And this leads to a good California rule of professional responsibility, 2-400, stating prohibited discriminatory conduct in law practice, like unlawful discrimination in employment, offering goods and services to the public. Very broad definition, but something worth keep thinking about. The protected classes are just a start. How do we define the various classes, who belongs in what class, other considerations such as apparent wealth, other factors. Perhaps broader definitions of diversity are helpful in defining the scope of our anti-bias efforts. Where can we remove the bias springs? We talk about gender, age, career experience, color, communication style, employment status, ethnicity, and the list goes on here. Thinking style, speed of learning, comprehension. These are things to think about that impact all of us, and arguably is there a bias for against these traits? Should we still be allowed to judge or discern, but judge with knowledge of the individual? Here's a question that I have. Are we still allowed to hire the best qualified? I'm going to get some mail on that. Arguably, it's an enlightened self-interest to hire those that are best qualified, who will make the most money for themselves or for others or help the organization. Sort of the invisible hand theory from Adam Smith, Wealth of the Nations. I think that favors diversity because you hire who's the best, and you're blind to these other 50 attributes that may be considered diverse, and you don't prejudge against things. You hired the best person for the job. It helps the organization, helps them, helps society. And is that something to consider? And doesn't that have a bias in favor of diversity? I think there's room for reasonable minds to argue, but I'd be derelict to not bring that point up. How do we reduce bias? One theory is to unite groups by a common goal or common identity. Law firms have team building exercises. But what's interesting is you can unite a large law firm, however, members of the law firm may become biased against members of other law firms. And this human condition is difficult. Stopping the cycle is difficult. Let's look at Mideast politics. Furthermore, how do we reduce bias? direct meetings between groups may not work well. In meetings between groups, all group members must feel equal. This is a good transition to the issue of what can individuals do to reduce bias. How do we make everyone feel equal? And one of the quick stories I have is to be mindful of subject matter in your small talk. Some judges won't talk about fishing or other activities that are classically male activities on the theory that women could be offended. And I'm not opposed to such careful subject matter discussed by a judge. How do we make everyone feel equal? We need to be mindful of vicious small talk with a twist of one-upsmanship. And speaking with others, our hobbies and possessions and first world problems may be used to put down others. We want to avoid such jokes as my child's school has excellent diversity. We have both violinists and cellists. I've actually heard this spoken in jest, but it was offensive, and we need to be mindful of this. We need to be careful to stick to business, avoid discussions that are political. That's not helpful. And sports or other activities that may be divisive amongst between categories of interests of people. I like the skilled mediator example. A lot of skilled mediators and other successful people have studied the you point of view made popular by Dale Carnegie's book, How to Win Friends and Influence People, which has been in print for over 70 years. I'm amazed when I go to a bookstore, it's still being printed out. And the gist of it is, in speaking with others, think about the other person. A meaningful conversation may be a private conversation. Avoid a grandstand story. And careful connection is a good way to reduce bias. A lot of good mediators you might meet at a jam settlement conference or construction defect settlement conference. A good mediator will talk to you in private and have a connection. Think about what are your concerns, which makes you more amenable to hearing about concerns of selling the case or getting the overall project over the finish line. Now, this doesn't mean that we'll become pleasers and ignore our own interests and desires, but it just means we think about the other person a little bit. I think if we do that, that helps bridge a lot of bridges of diversity and inclusion. What is bias in action? And some of these are old stories and new stories. I'm sure we've all seen, maybe some of us are too young to ever see this, but in a deposition, asking one of the females in the room for a copy of the transcript or an exhibit that's been known. And also bias in action in an IP law firm. Maybe the patent writers or patent prosecutors aren't invited to a party. Instead, the patent litigators are invited because they're known as being more boisterous, more lively. And yes, the bias may drill down to this level. I get invited to parties, but some patent prosecutors are known to be kind of dry. They don't get invited out that much. And also what's interesting here, and this is controversial, I'll get some hate mail on this, but in some large law firms, various associates are encouraged to serve on diversity committees and thus lose billable hours. But who dares complain about that? So there's a lot of sticky issues here to address. Can we learn to withhold judgment? There are very few emergencies in the legal field or profession. We usually have time to study and think before making decisions or acting. I mean, we're not surgeons. Somebody bleeding out on our table, a case comes in, maybe there's some deadlines, but we have a few moments to think before we act and check in with ourselves about how we treat others and is it a fair and equitable treatment that we have in mind. I think it's good to question everything, especially in this field where all the literature states that whatever we're doing just isn't working. So we have to ask ourselves, does a mere study and rote following of state bar rules address the larger issues of diversity and inclusion? In general, the reasons for our diversity and bias problems have been a taboo subject. People haven't talked about evolution, group theory, fight or flight. But I think these are things that are important to talk about because, again, whatever we're doing isn't working. But I think there's ample room for your own thoughts and your own writings on this because it's a field that needs improvement. And it's a good subject to ponder because it gets into social interaction, evolution, group theory, and just human nature in general. And then we want to ask, has bias been reduced over the past 5 years? Probably not a whole lot. And if you had a spring failure in a mechanical arm, wouldn't you investigate? Would you hesitate to figure out why isn't this mechanical arm working? You take it apart. You have no qualms about studying everything. And I would suggest that we would do the same for this subject. In summation, I want to go over some of the bigger attributes and bigger issues that we spoke of during this presentation and drill down to a little more granularity as to what the current studies are showing. From a big picture level, I think that the Bernowski's book, The Ascent of Man, has to be looked at. It dovetails in obviously with Darwin and how did our brains evolve? And isn't it just no wonder at all that our lives in the last 10,000 years are good in certain ways, but unfair and horrible in others, because we didn't evolve to live in this world of offices and to do farming, to sit still, and to have these types of social interactions, especially when you consider the social interactions we have now with social media and the internet, world news. It's a different world, and our brains arguably just aren't quite up for it. So of course we're going to have problems. And if we look at our theories of group theory, the literature is really solid. Groups help. But what's interesting and almost discouraging is that we find that there's articles about keeping associates happy in large law firms. And one of them is to make them feel included in the group. So happiness is often equated with being in the group, but yet bias, prejudice, warfare, acrimony, evilness happens from people in a perceived different group. So it's a troubling dichotomy. There's no easy answer for it, but we'd be derelict to not sort of think about being in the group feels good, but let's be nice to people who are out of the group, although that runs contra to our lower brainstem that developed over millions of years to help us survive. And to get a bit more granular in the data, I'm looking at, according to the NALP, that states that as women of color are best represented among summer associates and well represented among associates, but then leave the lawyer ranks each year at a higher rate than white men, accumulating a dramatic underrepresentation among equity partners. And this is from my slide number 11, where I highlighted with just 1 in 5 equity partners being women and only 7.6% of equity partners being people of color. So this is a very sobering statistic. It's current and presents a lot of really interesting opportunities, problems, and realities. And that the summer associate class can be very diverse, but as you go up as the years unwind, it's the white men who seem to do well there or survive at the end. And I think that could be a product of society in general, going back to the theory that in well-represented or high-paying jobs, the ethnicity does not match that of the underlying society. So in other words, if you've got the board of Clorox is all a bunch of white men, And does it make sense that they would gravitate and hire the white men of large law firms? This is not a popular view, but I think it's an unfortunate reality, perhaps something that needs to be looked at with great care. And this dovetails into a current movement to have more diversity in the boards of corporations, which have traditionally been just white guys sitting around. So I think as society in general puts more emphasis on diversity, I think that will trickle into the law firms and sort of help this stat here that I'm looking at on slide 11, where just 7.6 of equity partners are people of color. I wonder if that also reflects the current ethnicity mix of large corporations in their boardrooms as we're here today. So again, this is a larger societal challenge, and we need to look at society in general, figure it out, more diversity and inclusion, as well as remember that the word inclusion can be double-edged because we love our groups, but let's learn to love others in other groups as well. I look forward to your comments on this. My email address is there. People do send me email all the time. This year I have my LinkedIn address. You can communicate with me in that matter. And I hope that all of us are sort of thinking about this subject a little bit differently, thinking about when we see someone who's from a different group than ours, whether it's we self-identify or it's a random group, how do we feel in our gut? And if we sit with it and think about it, can we just sort of get beyond that? And I think the answer is yes, but we have to be conscious of it and not be afraid to look at the underlying reasons for why we think the way we do. Thank you for your attention here, and I look forward to your comments.